We've got this, let's call it a bold analysis of Mario Draghi's vision for Europe, and frankly, it's got people talking.
Right, and for good reason.
So, before we unpack all the details, can you give us the quick rundown? Who is Draghi, and why should we care what he has to say about Europe's economic future?
Well, think of it this way. When Mario Draghi talks, the whole financial world listens.
He's not just some talking head.
Exactly. This is the guy, the former president of the European Central Bank, the one who famously said he'd do whatever it takes to save the euro. Now he's basically saying Europe needs a serious reality check if it wants to keep up with the big players like the US and China.
Okay, so Draghi's ringing the alarm bells. But what's got him so worried? What's the big problem he sees holding Europe back?
He keeps hammering on this one key issue, and that's productivity.
Productivity, right. But for those of us who don't geek out on economic jargon, what does that actually mean?
In a nutshell, it's about efficiency. How much are we producing as a continent compared to everyone else using the same amount of resources?
And Draghi's saying Europe isn't cutting it.
Sadly, no, not by a long shot. He's pointing to a few major factors. First, we've got an aging population.
Right. Fewer young workers.
Then there's this reliance on what he calls old industries, sectors that are struggling to keep up with the times.
And those aren't exactly known for their cutting-edge innovation.
Exactly. And finally, he argues that Europe just isn't fostering the kind of groundbreaking innovation that's driving growth in other parts of the world.
Okay, so we're not as productive, we're behind the times, and our innovation game is weak. Paint a picture for our listeners. Give us a real-world example of what this actually looks like.
Sure. Let's take a look at something everyone understands: cars. For decades, Europe has been a powerhouse in traditional car manufacturing.
Some of the most iconic car brands in the world.
Right. But now, with the rise of electric vehicles, the game's changed.
And Europe's stuck in first gear.
Pretty much. Meanwhile, China, they saw the writing on the wall and went all in on electric. Now they're leading the charge, producing more electric vehicles, developing the latest battery tech, the whole 9 yards.
So they saw the future and hit the gas, while Europe's pumping the brakes.
You could say that. And that's what Draghi's warning about. If Europe misses the boat on key technological shifts like this, and it's not just cars, it risks falling behind economically big time.
That means
fewer jobs, less investment, and overall slower economic growth. Not exactly the recipe for a bright future, right?
definitely not. So Draghi's laid out this pretty stark reality check. The question is, how does he propose to fix it? So it sounds like Draghi's prescription for Europe's economic anemia is a hefty dose of, well, ambition.
Ambition with a capital A. He lays out 3 main areas where Europe needs to make major moves. First up, supercharging innovation.
Okay, so no more resting on our laurels. We got to become an innovation powerhouse. But how do we actually do that? Europe's not exactly known for being a startup haven.
And Draghi knows that. One of the biggest roadblocks he points to is the state of Europe's capital markets.
Fragmented, aren't they? 27 different countries, each with their own rules and regulations.
Exactly. And that makes it incredibly difficult for startups to access the kind of funding they need to really scale up and compete on a global level.
It's like trying to assemble a puzzle where all the pieces are different shapes and sizes. It's a mess.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
He contrasts this with the US, where you have places like Silicon Valley.
The mothership of startups.
Right, a centralized hub where venture capitalists and entrepreneurs are practically tripping over each other. That kind of ecosystem, that easy access to capital, it's crucial for fostering rapid growth, and Draghi wants to see something similar in Europe.
Easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how do you harmonize financial systems across 27 different countries, each with their own economic priorities and, let's be honest, their own egos?
That's the billion-euro question, isn't it? And even if we could wave a magic wand and create this pan-European Silicon Valley, that's just one piece of the puzzle. Draghi's next ambition might be even more challenging.
Which is?
Decarbonization. He's talking about a complete overhaul of Europe's energy infrastructure, a massive shift towards renewables.
Going green on a continental scale sounds great in theory, but let's talk practicality. We're already grappling with sky-high energy costs.
And this isn't exactly going to be cheap.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
So how does he propose to pay for this massive energy transition?
Well, this is where things get really interesting and potentially controversial. He believes that a key part of funding this green revolution, along with his other ambitious goals, is going to involve something called mutualized debt.
Mutualized debt. Now, there's a term that's bound to spark some debate. Can you break it down for us? What does that actually mean in plain English?
Essentially, it means sharing the responsibility for debt among the different countries in the European Union.
So instead of each country going it alone, it's more like a Europe-wide pool of resources.
Exactly. Think of it like Eurobonds, where the entire bloc shares the burden of repayment. The idea is that this would allow countries to take on bigger projects, like a massive shift to renewable energy, that they might not be able to afford on their own.
Okay, so strength in numbers.
Right.
But I'm sensing there are some potential downsides here, especially for certain countries.
Right. And this is where the analysis you shared gets really interesting because it focuses on the potential implications for Italian investors.
Because Italy, if I remember correctly, has a pretty high private savings rate, right?
Exactly. Italians are known for their thriftiness. But when you start talking about mutualized debt, critics worry that those savings could end up being seen as a potential source of funds to back this shared debt.
So it's one thing for governments to share the responsibility of debt, but it's another thing entirely if citizens start to feel like their personal savings are being eyed to prop up other countries' economies.
Precisely. And this is where the whole concept of mutualized debt gets really tricky because you're dealing with not just economic theory, but also national pride, anxieties about sovereignty. Remember the Greek debt crisis?
Yeah, not exactly ancient history.
Right. That whole situation left a lot of people, especially in those countries that were seen as footing the bill, pretty wary of shared financial burdens.
It raised some big questions about how much risk individual countries are willing to take on for the sake of this idea of European unity. Right, the Greek debt crisis was a stark reminder that this whole idea of economic integration, it can be a bit of a double-edged sword. But before we spiral down that rabbit hole, let's get back to Draghi's plan. We've got boosting innovation, tackling decarbonization, both of which come with hefty price tags, and this whole idea of mutualized debt. What about his third big idea, this push to reduce reliance on China? That seems especially relevant in today's world.
Absolutely. Draghi calls it strategic autonomy, basically lessening Europe's dependence on China, particularly when it comes to things like critical supply chains.
We've all seen what happens when those global supply chains get disrupted. Suddenly your new phone is 6 months late, or that car part you need is stuck on a container ship somewhere. Not to mention the geopolitical risks.
Exactly. No one wants to be overly reliant on a single country, especially one that may not always share our values or interests. But decoupling from China after decades of intertwined economies, it's not going to be easy.
That's an understatement. So how does Draghi propose to untangle this economic Gordian knot?
He emphasizes the need for diversification, finding new sources for those goods that we've become reliant on from China, but also, crucially, investing in homegrown industries and technologies.
So less reliance on imports, more focus on building things ourselves.
Exactly. And that might mean accepting higher prices in the short term.
Which is a tough sell, especially now with inflation already biting everyone's wallets.
Absolutely. And that gets to the heart of the challenge here. There's often a trade-off between short-term economic pain and long-term strategic gain.
And Draghi's betting that Europe is willing to make some sacrifices now to ensure a more secure and prosperous future.
The question is he right?
So let's recap. We've got these three massive goals: supercharged innovation, a full-blown green energy revolution, and disentangling ourselves from China. Each one a tall order on its own.
To say the least.
And then there's the big question looming over all of this. Can Draghi actually convince Europe to buy into his vision?
Well, the source you shared seems pretty skeptical.
And they're probably not alone.
Not at all. I mean, let's be realistic. This is 27 different countries we're talking about.
27 different sets of interests,
Yeah.
histories, political systems.
Exactly. And getting them all on the same page, especially when you're talking about things like shared debt, potential sacrifices.
Herding cats.
Worse. Because these cats have nuclear weapons.
That's a scary thought. So what are some of the biggest hurdles Draghi's plan is likely to face?
Well, you've got the usual suspects, right? Concerns about national sovereignty. Nobody wants to feel like they're giving up control over their own economy.
Especially to bureaucrats in Brussels.
Right. And then there's the whole issue of economic track records. Some countries are going to be more gung-ho about sharing the burden than others.
Yeah, those memories of the Greek debt crisis are still pretty fresh.
Exactly. But I think there's actually a deeper issue here, something that goes beyond the usual political and economic roadblocks.
Lay it on us.
It's about mindset. Draghi isn't just asking for a few policy tweaks here and there. He's talking about a fundamental shift in how Europeans see themselves.
Less like individual nations, more like a united front.
Exactly. He's asking them to think of themselves as a collective force, a true global power that can stand toe-to-toe with the US and China.
And that's a tough sell.
It is, because it requires a level of trust, of solidarity that frankly hasn't always been there.
Especially when times get tough like they are now.
Exactly. It's easy to talk about shared sacrifices in the abstract. It's a lot harder when you're asking people to accept higher energy prices, potential cuts to social programs, all in the name of this long-term vision.
It's a gamble.
It is. And the source you shared picks up on a really interesting detail, the timing of all of this. Draghi's report drops right as a new European Commission is about to take office.
So it's like he's laying down a challenge to this new leadership team.
Or at least giving them a roadmap. Will they pick up the mantle and try to push through these ambitious reforms? Or will it be business as usual in Brussels?
Place your bets, listeners. It's going to
yeah.
be fascinating to see how this all plays out. So we've covered a lot of ground here. What's the key takeaway for our listeners? What's the one thing they should remember from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the future of Europe is very much up in the air right now.
No crystal ball.
None whatsoever. The decisions that European leaders make in the coming months and years will have huge implications.
Not just for Europe, but for the whole world.
Exactly. And for our listeners, especially those in Italy who are rightly concerned about what this might mean for their savings, their livelihoods.
Pay attention, folks. This is your future we're talking about.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note of informed uncertainty, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Draghi's bold vision for Europe's future. It's a story that's far from over, and we'll be watching closely to see what happens next.